Welcome, fellow wizards, to the Indie Game Lunch Hour. Today we're talking with Paolo Abela about deadly mistakes that can kill your multiplayer project and how to avoid them.
The Indie Game Lunch Hour.
The bot always takes like an intermittent amount of time to actually start that jingle, so there's always like a little awkward pause there. We'll figure that out at some point. I don't know. Who knows? In our live magical podcast, we give devs the chance to hear stories of breaking in from industry experts, as well as directly ask them questions about their areas of expertise in the second half of each episode. This is a mostly unedited recording of a weekly event we actually host in our Discord, so we'd love to have you come join us next Wednesday, 12 p.m. Eastern Time, to ask your questions live. I'm your host, Willem Delventhal, the headmaster of the Indie Game Academy and the Wizard of Joy, and joining me today is Paolo Abela. Paolo is a senior software engineer at Unity, the co-founder of Fatus Games, an independent game studio, as well as an indie multiplayer consultant for those who are confused by the fascinating and yet terrifying world of multiplayer game development. Welcome, Paolo. What are you having for lunch today?
So I'm Italian, and so to honor my tradition, I add pasta, of course, with tomato sauce and octopus that my girlfriend made. So that was a great start of the day. I'm currently in Canary Islands, so I already had lunch a few hours ago. So super happy to be here with you today. I hope I can be helpful for all those that are listening to us. And yeah, that's it. Open to your questions.
Amazing. Welcome. I am. That's possibly the fanciest answer I've ever had to that question. Usually the answer is I'm not actually eating lunch and I'm just sipping on tea right now or coffee. So it's amazing. You just have this like beautiful restaurant level food just prepared for you. That sounds like the dream.
Wow. I mean, that's common when you're Italian. Like we have this food tradition that we used to eat a lot. Simply.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm having oatmeal, so mine's less exciting today. Amazing though. So let's jump into things. Multiplayer is definitely one of the reasons I was excited to have this conversation with you is because multiplayer is one of those black boxes in game dev. I was saying this to you a little bit before we started recording. Mm-hmm. There's a couple of those. A lot of the tech roles, like tech art, are similar black boxes where people don't really understand how to look into that world and what the world is actually like. Multiplayer, of course, is more prevalent. It's more in our lives, but inevitably, every time one of our students starts trying to implement multiplayer, it becomes this massive thing. And a lot of the time in our smaller programs, we actually recommend people just don't do multiplayer, or if they do multiplayer, they do like local multiplayer, because it's just so much that actually goes into multiplayer game development. So I'm kind of excited to talk about it and get some tips from you. Before then, though, we have our standard question that we always ask to kick things off, which is for your origin story. So Paolo, tell us how you got started in game development and how you got to where you are today.
Okay, so I started about 12 years ago. One day I decided that I wanted to start making games. So I bought a book from Will Goldstone, which is a guy at Unity, a pretty important guy at Unity. I found out later. That was about like making games with Unity 5 or Unity 4 at the time. I don't remember. So I started following that and, made this little project, and I had a lot of fun doing that. So I said, okay, I want to do this for the rest of my life. So I gathered a few friends and said, hey, do you want to start making games? Do you want to have a try at that? And they were like, oh, yeah, cool, let's try it. Yeah. So out of, let's say 10 people, we lost a few over the road. But basically, we started this little group, of course, as it always happens with projects. We started with this little group that eventually evolved into a full-fledged 56 people company making games in Italy. That lasted 7 years. It was called StarworkGC.
Wow.
So yeah, that was pretty much it. We started as a game. It started as a passion thing. Also because I'm a gamer, I've been a gamer for like 23 years now. And I basically grew up playing games. I play games all the time. So I play games with my girlfriend, friends, everybody. So, there's a lot of passion there. And this is pretty common among game developers, as you probably already know. And I'm just very lucky that it became my full-time job over time.
So, I mean, that's amazing. That's already an incredible start. I think the fact that you founded this yourself, that you were one of the co-founders?
Yeah. Actually, most people usually join a studio and then they learn things in that studio, and then they say, "Oh, I want to do my own thing." I did the exact opposite. I started from the wrong side. I said, "Okay, let's make a company first, and let's learn how to do games while building the company." And that was pretty exciting at the time, frightening, and stressful as hell, I have to say. But but over time, I'm pretty glad that it went that way, because it gave me a head start over many things, and also gave me the chance to experience how it is from the leadership side before getting and moving to the more employee side and that part of things. So that was for the first company. At some point, we shut down that company, which made a few games, some single player, some multiplayer, some in VR, and I went working for Madfinger Games. Which is a company in Czech Republic that works that makes Dead Trigger, Shadowgun games, and other mobile stuff. And after a few months, I got an offer from Unity, and I joined Unity, where I've been working for the last 4 years now.
Amazing.
So simply, yeah, pretty much that. In the meantime, when I joined Unity, I also started working on the card game that I mentioned earlier, Ariokan, on Fatus Games. So I co-founded the studio with a few that were left from the previous startup, and it has been like 3.5 years that we're working on that. And at the same time, like a few years later, 1 year ago, I started this independent consulting thing to help other people making multiplayer games.
So what I'm getting out of this is that, what I'm getting out of this is that you were a very busy guy.
a bit. I try to manage all the responsibilities. I have to say they employ me in different ways. Working and actually this is good, because working at a big company is a bit more of a relaxed thing. You could say you also don't get many chances to, to be yourself at 100%, or to also, have very deep and active participation, because you're just a clog in a machine. And this is pretty common in all big companies. So I get the best of all worlds. I try to get the best of all worlds. So I'm working in a big company, working as the head of a studio, and also working independently. So I'm trying to figure out what's the best thing. And trying to manage it.
Hard to know. I mean, it's all good in some ways. Awesome. That's such a fantastic story. I also, it's interesting that you say like it's so much more chill and relaxed, and that you work so much on the side, because that's now the position I have found myself in. And it's only that way because actually somebody similar to you gave me the perspective that they really like having a full-time job as well as their startup, because the full-time job, of course, provides funding. That sure is nice. But then also, depending on the company, of course, there's always kind of some space, especially those larger studios where you just kind of have a slower day or something like that. And so the ability to work in your startup and learn from both of those things at the same time, I think that's the biggest part, is incredibly valuable. Like I feel like I'm learning so much. I'm just getting fire hosed with knowledge all the time from two different places, and it's awesome.
Yeah, it's great. It's great, especially because you get to experiment way more when you are in a startup, and also to face different challenges than the ones that you face at a bigger company. Because a bigger company doesn't need to survive. Like they already have their business proven, most of the time at least. They already have their business proven. They know how to make money. When you're at a gaming startup and you are like few people trying to make indie games, well, that's a totally different story. You need to figure out how to compete with the giants that are out there, how to be creative, and so you need to come up and really use your brain, which is something that it's always good.
So what was the name of your original startup again? Remind me.
The first one?
Yes, the first one.
The first one was StarworkGC. I can write it in the chat.
StarworkGC. Yeah, I'm just curious. Yeah. So that company then financially supported 56 people? Like that was everybody's primary job? Or was everybody kind of working side jobs?
No, we were kind of working that on side jobs, so we didn't really manage to financially support the company over time. So we relied a bit on contractors, or sometimes on volunteers, or sometimes on students that wanted to do internships, which went like in the long term, in the long run, was really favorable to all of us, because we all gathered a lot of experience, and now most of these people work actually in other gaming companies. So one of the issues that we always face, in the gaming industry is, how do I break in? And one thing that I always try to recommend is join a studio early on, even if you don't get paid, even if you can, if you can manage that, of course, like if you live with your parents, or if you don't really mind that time of your life, you get a lot of experience. You get to work with other people. You get to build a portfolio of serious things. And that's something that really helps. or at least it helped for the people that came that came across.
Yeah. What I love about this too is I am a big fan of getting people to found their own studios. I want people to, well, we always say at the Indie Game Academy, we want people to pave their own path. So if you're excited to go work for a big company, hell yeah, we want to help you do it. But I personally, my dream is to have more people running their own studios. I want to do, there's that techie buzzword, decentralization. I want that. I want as many small studios building things as possible. And one of the things I love about your story is that your company didn't necessarily make enough money to fund 56 people's full-time jobs, but it survived for a number of years, released a number of games, and as a result, a big chunk of your people are working full-time jobs now, are in the industry.
Yes.
So this is a perfect test case for everybody out there that even if your company doesn't like go crazy and become one of the big indie hits, it's still valuable. It's still experience that gained you a lot of prosperity in your life, whether directly or, in this case, a little bit more indirectly. So found studios, first lesson. If it feels right, if it's what you want to do. We're not going to pressure anybody into doing it. Definitely a lot of work. Well, let's jump into the topic of the day. So you gave us this very beautifully written episode title. They're not always this beautiful. Deadly mistakes that can kill your multiplayer project and how to avoid them. I'm loving it. This is like perfect clickbait. I'm 100% in. So so give us your introduction to the concept. Give us the 101 on multiplayer problems that may sink your project and some of the ways we can avoid them.
Sure. So the thing is, as you said, many people try to make multiplayer games, but making multiplayer games is super hard. Like if you can think of a single player game and you want to make the multiplayer version of that, the difficulty can range from 10 to 100 times that. Because when you make things multiplayer, there are so many factors that chime in to break your stuff and break your game. So everything that works in single player doesn't necessarily work in multiplayer. And most of the times, if you don't do things the right way from the start, you're in for a very bad surprise a few months later in the process when you try to implement a few things and you realize, oh God, I failed to implement this thing. I failed to make this right decision in the early on. Can I swear, by the way?
Yes.
Okay,
Swearing
cool.
welcome.
I will try to not do that, but sometimes a fuck will come up.
Give it like a PG-13. You can get a couple in there.
Okay.
Just don't go crazy.
Okay, cool. So, for example, like one super common mistake when making multiplayer games is that you pick the wrong multiplayer framework. So, when you're making a game, you need to evaluate different aspects of that game. Like depending on the number of players that are going to play it, depending on the pace of the game, if it's fast-paced like an FPS or slow-paced like a card game, you need to use different tech. And if you fail to use the right tech, then you come out, then in a few months you realize, oh, this framework that I choose and on top of which I built my entire game on doesn't support the use case that is part of my core game. So what do I do now? And then the answer is, well, good luck. You need to rewrite half of your game.
You're done now. You're doomed.
Basically that's it, which is super risky. And the worst part is that multiplayer expertise isn't that common in teams. So as I said, working as an independent consultant, I talk with lots of teams. Also, like with my job at Unity, I get the chance to talk with a different indie studios, but also like bigger studios. And most of the time, the guys making multiplayer games, they don't have multiplayer specialists in their team. They're like, oh, we made some successful single-player games earlier. Now let's try to make some multiplayer games. And we'll figure it out. No, you won't figure it out. That's the problem. That's the issue. That figuring it out is costly and takes a lot of time. So picking the wrong multiplayer framework is just one of the deadliest mistakes, because sometimes you can afford spending 6 more months rebuilding your game and the budget, and most of the times you can't, so you just die out.
And what people don't realize is like 6 or 8 months, it's for a studio that is a little bit more like passion led, for a studio where everybody is working a part-time job in order to sustain the fact that they're working on a studio. Time can feel like a little bit less pressured. It can feel like, oh, well, I mean, we can keep working on this as long as we need to. Like, oh, it sucks, of course, to have to work for 6 to 8 more months. But what you don't really realize is that you are, like, think about it like you have an actual budget. You're blowing your budget and extending your framework independently, your roadmap almost indefinitely with things like this. It is one of the most common things I see with indie studios where people will assume it's going to take them 6 months, a year, and then the game literally takes them 4 years. And part of the reason that it takes so much longer is because of little moments like this. where you're like, oh shit, we built the wrong multiplayer framework and now we have to go back. And there's less pressure in more indie studios to stick to your roadmap, but everything is costing you dollars. And if nothing else, it's costing you your life. It's costing you 6 to 8 months longer.
And also, talking about the time, another issue that also affects people that don't really have a monetary budget is that you lose time to market. So time to market is a very important concept that says that you need to release your game at the right time, right? So if something is very popular in a moment and you release that type of game genre in that moment, then you have better chances to being noticed. Releasing a battle royale today is crazy because Fortnite has been there for 8 years. PUBG has been there for years, so you don't do that. So if you were working on a battle royale and you picked the wrong multiplayer framework years ago, you are now rebuilding it, and in the meantime, the market went on. No? So this is kind of an issue that also affects people and teams that don't really have a monetary budget, but still have the time and work as a side.
It's very true. So give me this. I have worked on a couple of multiplayer games, but professionally, I tend to work on single player games. And so I only have the sort of like experimental indie experience on multiplayer titles. And despite that, I pretty quickly ran into problems with multiplayer that I wouldn't have predicted, that I didn't think were a problem. So some of them are actually technical. Some of them are non-technical. For instance, we experimented with a battle royale game in my own indie studio. And one of the reasons we didn't go with it is because we realized we would need such a significant concurrent player base to actually have people playing our multiplayer game. So terrible idea as your first game right out the gate. So give me some of those. Like, what are some of the really common pitfalls? The literally like some of the first pitfalls you're going to run into that people don't really realize if they haven't yet experimented with multiplayer.
So the first thing is that if you're making a fast-paced game, you probably need to implement something that is called prediction and reconciliation, or the close friend that is netcode rollback. So imagine that you are making a shooter, okay? You aim at something and you shoot. So if this is a single player, everything is happening, what you see is really happening in that moment. If this is a multiplayer game, that's not like that. The position of the other person is not the real position, because that's what you're seeing based on the latency that divides you and that separates you, the server, and the other player that is playing that game. So the main issue is that things are not where they seem to be. So when you shoot at something, your game has to figure it out and understand where the projectile really needs to go and do some calculations, assuming that there is some latency, because we can't beat the speed of light, and it takes some time for the signal to travel between one computer, the server, and the other one. And this is what we call latency. So things usually are delayed by a few tens of milliseconds if you're lucky, a few hundreds of milliseconds if your network is crap. And your game needs to take this into account. So this is one of the common pitfalls, that somebody tries to make shooters or fast-paced games, and then they use a multiplayer framework that doesn't support out of the box these use cases, and then they start making some playtests. So they build the entire game, they build the shooting system, they build the movement system, and so on. Then they start playing with other players, doing like alpha tests and so on. And everybody complains that they shoot at somebody and they didn't hit. Super common. Now you are in a very serious problem, because this is one of the core features, and if it sucks, the entire game sucks. So you now need to switch the multiplayer frame. So this is one of the issues. The other one is the one that you mentioned. Like, people say, oh yeah, we are going to make this multiplayer game that requires, let's say, 30 players per room. And you're like, okay, do you have the community already? Like, do you have a famous IP that can bring somebody here? Or do you have like a huge marketing push that you can do in the first days to be really, really sure that there will be enough players there? And most of the time the answer is no. So what do you do then? And there are a few tricks that you can apply here. Like, you can have very, very, very smart bots, which is something that happens, and you can disguise them as players. There's nothing bad into that, as long as it's in the starting phase. It's like a necessary means, because this is a chicken and egg problem. Like, until your game becomes successful, you won't have enough players, unless you have this super big IP or super big marketing push, which most indies don't have. So you need to be creative there. You need to make some bots that are disguised as players, try to reduce the number of queues and the dispersion of players within your game. So maybe I have just one game mode, redirect everybody there instead of having like 3 different game modes. Everybody required which each one of these requires different amount of players, and you are, you divide your player base, which is already thin at the beginning. So you need to be careful about those. I don't know. Are these answers the ones that you were expecting? Oh.
Some of them are. So the interesting, give me the actual terminology so that I can make sure I remember. It's called predictive what?
Prediction and reconciliation.
Prediction and reconciliation.
Reconciliation, yes.
Reconciliation.
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, it is. For those who don't know, for those who maybe have literally never touched multiplayer architecture, you're of course not actually seeing the players in your game. In your local copy of the game, you're of course not seeing the real players. You don't have the same perspective because they're 2 different computers. So what you're actually seeing is kind of like an AI that is taking commands from what the players are doing on their machine. So the players are playing on their machine independently. It's sending over literally like key commands or positional data, and then the AI on your machine is mimicking what the other player is doing. That's how multiplayer works, which is maybe obvious, but some people may not even have realized that yet. So what we're talking about with prediction and reconciliation is those can get out of sync for a number of reasons. Somebody can have a lag spike. Or you can have just something that happens in the game that's unexpected on one computer. There's a bunch of machines all communicating what actually happens. So if one player sets off a giant explosion, that needs to go to all the players, and then maybe they have stuff happening in their machines. So it's kind of a nightmare of data flying back and forth. And like a fun fact for you, if anybody ever played old school shooters, like I remember this from Halo Combat Evolved, if your computer disconnects and all the players keep walking straight forward, that's exactly why, because that was one of their very simple prediction algorithms. It would just walk forward if nothing else, because that's probably what the player is doing.
Yeah, exactly. And then the same happens in League of Legends. Like if you ever disconnected from a League of Legends game, you will see people moving in the keep moving in that direction and so on. Because that's what the game is trying to predict. Like they predict that they are going to move in that direction if they were already moving in that direction. And imagine that all those things happen in a very, all those state changes happen in milliseconds. So when we play multiplayer games, like we need to send a lot of data, and we need to really be careful about the data that we send. Also because our computer and the other people's computer need to process this data, compress it, send it over the network, read it from the network, and decompress it, and then apply it to the game state. So there's a lot of things there's a lot of information that is traveling there. And if you let's say if you don't optimize that, you also get some latency and CPU spike issues most of the time. Yeah, but this is not like one of the tragical mistakes. There's also another one, which is one of the deadliest, absolutely deadliest, and that's adding multiplayer later. So you probably hear a lot of time studios saying, yeah, we're making a single player version of the game now, we'll add multiplayer later. No, you are not adding multiplayer later. What's happening later is that you're going to cry a lot over the fact that your game was built in single player and that you're now trying to transform that into a multiplayer game. So if you want to make a spaceship, you need to make a spaceship from the get-go. You don't build a car and then transform that into a spaceship. It's not the same thing. Like it's a different thing, right? And this is one of the deadliest mistakes. So imagine like that you are making a survival shooter. Okay, so you have players that can, but you're making that single player first. So you can go around, you can scavenge, you can kill zombies, these kinds of things. You can gather resources and you can build your own base. Okay. So if you want to make that multiplayer later on, what happens is that you need to synchronize all those things. You need to take into account that other players can kill the zombies, that the zombies can attack different players, that somebody might have ownership over different buildings, that you might not be able to attack, this because it's an ally, this because it's an enemy. There are many things that you really need to take into account. So whenever I hear we're making a single player version, we'll make the multiplayer version later, I'm there saying, yeah, sure. Good luck with that. So this is one of the of those.
One of the big ones. Well, so how about this? Somebody who wants to, they've had an incredibly successful single player game and they want to add multiplayer. What is the correct path? How do they do that?
So it's not that you can't do that. It's that it requires a lot more of time and money investment. So it's fine if your game was actually successful in the beginning. I mean, if you didn't plan to make the multiplayer version and you end up having a game that is so successful, that's not an issue. Okay, that's not an issue because probably you have the budget and money to, time and money to spend to make the conversion, but it's going to take time. So you shouldn't be making promises to your players saying, oh, okay, we just released a single player version. Since it's going well, we release the multiplayer update next week. No, okay, it's next year, maybe. But one thing that you can definitely do is that if you have an idea that your game might be multiplayer in the future, you can make the single player one as if it's multiplayer. So when you make a multiplayer game, what does this mean? When you make a multiplayer game, you can run a server and a client on the same machine. So the server is the one that makes all the decisions. The client is the computer of the players or the device of the players, right? If you make the server and the client in the same machine, you are basically playing single player. But all your environment is multiplayer. So you are already setting up your game to work in a multiplayer way from the day before. Just at that point, you only need to separate the server code from the client code, or make basically two different builds, one that executes as the server and the other one that executes as the client. So I would say, think of your game, like when you're starting your game, think of your game as something that might evolve into a multiplayer game. If it might evolve into a multiplayer game, it might make sense to build like the fake single player version first using multiplayer technology. And you don't have all the issues. Sorry?
Yeah, I'm imagining that meme of like the two astronauts in space, and one astronaut's been like, "It's been multiplayer the whole time."
The whole time. Yeah, something like that. And the advantage of that approach is that since you're playing, locally, the latency is zero, so it's basically as if you're playing single player games.
Right. But the architecture is already there. You aren't going to have to invest too much into making multiplayer happen. Really interesting. What about this? So you said if it's a game that may make sense to move into multiplayer, how does somebody judge that? So a lot of our listeners are indies, so they aren't people with massive budgets. A lot of them are doing it totally independent. They're bushwhacking it. They're just using the money that they have out of their own pockets. So there isn't a lot for them to throw around. How does one know if it might make sense for their game to turn multiplayer?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that if you have an AI that plays against you using the same, tools that you use or the same features that you use to play against them, that AI might one day become a player. So if you're making, let's say, a single player game, okay, and it's a card game, well, it's probably going to evolve into a multiplayer one. I mean, it has the chances to evolve into a multiplayer one. Or if you have companions in your single player game, then you can probably make that companion somebody that is a real person instead of an AI over time. So that could be a criteria, for example.
Yeah, and then it seems like the alternate approach is, or not alternate, just the other consideration is just if it is going to be multiplayer, if you believe this is a multiplayer game, just make it a multiplayer game. And don't worry about starting with a single player, perhaps. I do think your first consideration, that's one of the reasons we didn't go with. Our studio prototyped a battle royale that was a space trader. So imagine like EVE Online, but a battle royale. We thought that was awesome, so much fun, but it needed 100 concurrent players for every single game, and that was just like impossible for any studio. So it's kind of, I think, just asking yourself if you genuinely have a community that can support multiplayer is a big part of the question as well. And if trying to make your single player game popular will help you get there, that's a consideration, I think, but that's also less likely. Remember that going from a non-existent studio to a pretty big community base is unlikely. It just doesn't happen that often. It's a boom or bust industry. How about this? So you've mentioned that picking the correct multiplayer tool, the correct framework, is one of the big considerations as well. Can you tell us about some of the frameworks, and then perhaps the one you recommend most regularly, or the one you recommend for beginners, maybe?
Yeah, sure. So there are a few ones, and as I say, they really depend on the type of project that you're working on. So I would say, for example, one that I use a lot is Mirror, which is an open source version of one very old Unity-made framework called UNet that is now dead. and buried. So Mirror is one that is very no, not that sad. Like I had to work with that thing, and I wanted to cry in the early days. But
Never mind, not sad. Celebrate.
Yeah, not sad. No, yeah. Okay, cool. It did its job, but nope. So Mirror is one of the most popular alternatives because it's free and also has a lot of like open source contribution. It's actively maintained, so it's one that I constantly use in my projects. And it's also made for MMOs. Like even if it's made for MMOs, it can be used to do other stuff. It's fine. You can downgrade, let's say, the use case. The problem is upgrading the use case. So going from a framework that does not support fast-paced games to supporting fast-paced games, and that's the issue. But other popular ones are like the official Unity one. There's netcode for game objects, which is very close to Mirror because it originates from the same source. It just evolved into different things. And the good aspect about that is that it has a lot of community support, but also a lot of official support because it's the official one. For example, if you're making fast-paced games, Photon is a very good alternative. For example, the problem with that is mostly the pricing. It doesn't scale really well. So if you start getting some traction, you need to pay a lot. So there are a lot of frameworks. It really depends on the use case that you are trying to implement in that sense.
Sounds like probably Mirror is the one that you'd recommend people go and experiment with if they are curious and want to just kind of try stuff out. Is that right?
Yeah. I will also say netcode for game objects is a good alternative. I would avoid Photon unless you are really, forcing into that use case. Another one that can be interesting and is kind of easy and similar to the other ones that I mentioned is Fishnet. The only problem with Fishnet is that it's maintained by a single person, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a business risk to rely on that. But the good thing about Fishnet is that it has that magic prediction and reconciliation implemented out of the box. So it's very, very good if you're looking for, let's say, a cheaper Photon alternative in that sense.
Awesome.
But again, everyone has pros and cons, and it really depends on your specific use case.
I think there's one that maybe I'm not getting. I heard Mirror, Photon, Fishnet, and then what was the last one?
Netcode for game object.
Netcode for game objects. Yes.
Yes.
I think we used that for this like weird, interesting heist game. But that was a while ago and I wasn't the engineer. So who knows? All right. It's been wonderful to talk. Yeah. It's wonderful to talk. It's time to jump into some community questions to make sure that we get the audience engaged in asking you questions. So first up, we've got Rick. Rick, do you want to ask your question first?
Yeah, so at the beginning of this talk, you were talking about how you ran your own studio before you then joined other studios. And that's a similar path to what I've been on. So I'm very curious, what are some of the ways that having taken a shot at running your own studio has helped you in your transition to working at the less generalized employee level?
Okay, so to confirm my understanding, the question is how running my own studio helped into starting working as an employee later on?
Right, where you would perhaps not have the responsibility of running the whole studio, but you have a more specialized role where you don't have to handle everything.
Yeah, definitely. So when you run your own studio, especially if you are like the head of the studio, your eyes need to be everywhere. Like you are the CEO, but you literally need to be involved into many different things and ensure that all the machine works. Okay, you don't have to micromanage, like that's the bad thing, but you need to be aware of what's happening around you, and at the same time you need to be sure that the engine of the company is running. So it's a completely different set of responsibilities. That means that you are less and less involved into coding, for example. Even if you're a technical founder, you're way less involved into coding compared to like working as an employee. When you're an employee, you just need to do your specific role job. So you just focus on that. You don't have to worry about how the company is going to wake up tomorrow, or you need to worry about implementing the features and these kinds of things. So it's a very different skill set that is required, which is why I like to work at different places, because you keep growing on both sides of the things without forgetting about the other one. Did I answer your question, Rick?
So I was wondering how your experience was uniquely helpful in when you transitioned to doing the more specialized role. Like, was there a perspective that it brought to you that you felt very helpful?
Yes, I think it really helped me moving. Like when I went into an employee position, I coming from a CEO position, you have a critical eye over different aspects. Like you start getting outside of your single role, and you start questioning more things, trying to look at a broader strategy. So I think that having the previous CEO experiences allows you to have a broader look at what's happening in the company, even if you are just the employee, which is also like it's a blessing and a curse, because sometimes you don't have the power or you're not in the position to change things and change the course of things when you're just an employee. And that might be frustrating, but it definitely has impact in that sense.
Okay.
Awesome.
Very cool.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. I think we had like ages ago now, we'll have to bring him back at some point. We had George the Fat Man Sanger on this podcast. He's kind of a famous old hat in audio development in games. And he gave this like beautiful, inspiring talk about finding the U-shaped hole in the universe. And I think some of what you're talking about to that answer in particular is utilizing the skills that you have that nobody else has. And I think coming with that CEO perspective into a very much non-CEO role does have advantages that other people just aren't going to have.
Exactly.
All right. We have Mike on stage. Mike, do you want to ask about modding? It's going to be an interesting one.
Hello. I was just curious about how you could support the modding community during your development of your online game, because I've been playing Lethal Company, and mods have brought so much life to that game that it's something I would never want to not consider doing for my game.
It is an interesting question. I've actually worked on a modding tool, more or less, for the game I'm working on at Fatus Games, Ariokan, the card game. So the thing is, how I approach that, I try to expose some tools and some, let's say, some tools that can ingest data from the outside. So for example, in my case, if you allow the rule set of your game to be a JSON file, so a file that can be edited like in plain text, like with normal characters and words, and that your game reads at the beginning and then applies these rules to the game, then it's very easy for people to mod your game within the framework that you provide, of course. I'm not an expert of like modding at its purest form, so without the developer providing the tools for modding, so I can't help you on that. But I can tell you, if you plan to make a multiplayer game and you want people to experiment, let's say, with the rules of your multiplayer game and to maybe change how the game runs, well, if you provide, let's say, a JSON interpreter for that reads some file at the beginning of the session and applies the content of this file, of course checking if it doesn't contain any malicious content or something that will break the game, but you can allow people to experiment with your game in that sense. Does this answer your question, Mike?
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation of it. I haven't been hands-on the development side yet, but I just for my own awareness, I just want to know kind of how easy it was really to like allow people to mod, or if it's something that it's really you have to go out of your way to do, or But I guess it. Yeah, I didn't really understand the security aspect of it either, so it's helpful perspective as well.
Okay,
thank you.
Amazing. I think, unless I'm mistaken. Wow, it's time. It's still super loud for people. We've tried to turn the volume down and it hasn't worked. We'll figure that out soon. Welcome everybody to the question of the day. This is where we reiterate one of the most important points that we learned from Paolo to hopefully not forget it. So here is my question. Let's say you're thinking about making a game that you think maybe one day will become multiplayer. How do you set yourself up for success? What did Paolo suggest we do to make sure we don't get stuck spending 6 to 8 months rebuilding our game in multiplayer? There's one particular tip that he gave us. Start assuming it is multiplayer. That's kind of almost there. Tell me a little bit more. See a couple people typing. First person to get this correct gets 3 House Cup points. Build it as a single player hosted game. Yes, Rick. Rick, you're too smart. You get all the questions. Rick, yes, 3 House Cup points. Let us know which house you want to send that to. That is correct. If you're thinking maybe your game will become multiplayer someday, build it as if it's multiplayer right now. It's just that it is all hosted on a single machine. So it's a single multiplayer game played on a single machine. Amazing. All right. We have a question from Chamomile Mint. Chamomile does not have a mic, so I'm going to read it for him. The question, Paolo, is any differences in your advice when you are only interested in local area network multiplayer or a very small co-op game?
That's interesting. So, very small co-op doesn't really mean anything in the multiplayer world by the fact that it doesn't really change how you work on the game. So you still have to deal with latency. You still need to deal with all those things if it's over the network. So if it's outside of your local area network. If it's in your local area network, well, you have the advantage that the latency is way lower. So in that sense, it becomes less important to focus on prediction and reconciliation. So you usually, you get in the middle way between single player and multiplayer world. It's still very important to pick the right multiplayer framework from the get-go. That's for sure. And you still need to take into account that different players need to have ownership over different things. So when I say ownership, I mean who is allowed to do what with what object. So for example, every player has ownership over their own character, usually. So you can control yourself, but you can't control the other people's character, right? So these are still things that you need to take into account, even if it's a LAN game. Now, if it's local co-op can be done without any kind of multiplayer framework. Like you can just have a single player game and two different control sets. So you move, let's say, one with a controller or the other one with arrows or the other one with WASD. So you don't really have multiplayer there. It's just a single player game with, let's say 2, 3, or 4 different characters in that sense. So it's still single player real.
Yeah.
Multiplayer kicks in when you have different devices.
Yeah. Actual different devices sharing. That's actually, to extend the question, I guess, is there, would you give any kind of different advice for a small scale multiplayer game like Lethal Company, where there's only going to be 4 players communicating versus a battle royale with 100?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, it's two totally different things. If you're worried about, if you need to support 100 players, you need to implement things like interest management. So you need to be sure that players only see what's close to them. You don't really need to synchronize the position or data from very, very far objects. So all these kinds of things are ways to optimize the bandwidth. So when you have many players, the main area of concern is synchronizing the bandwidth, figuring out what to exclude and what to synchronize, what really needs to be synchronized. Also to avoid cheat.
Yes. So it sounds like, the more players you have, the more you have to care about bandwidth optimization, and the more you have to potentially care about people hacking.
Absolutely. Especially because if you're playing on a, let's say, also the people hacking thing is directly related to the competitiveness and esportsness of the game. So if you have ranked games, you need to be concerned about hacking, cheating. If you're trying to make a MOBA game and people can, decide if they took damage or not instead of the server deciding if they took damage or not, well, they are going to be invulnerable. And so this is an important concept. It's called authority. Like who has the authority? Is it the server? Is it the client? And usually if you're making a competitive game, you need to make things server authoritative. If you're making a non-competitive game, like a casual game or something that you just play, like Overcooked, who cares about cheating in Overcooked? Nobody cares about cheating. So you don't have to focus on that. You can have local authority, which makes things also smoother. But if you're making a competitive game, server authoritative is your thing. And it also makes things different from the architecture perspective of your code. Your code is not the same if it's server authoritative or client authoritative.
I love that. I love learning new lingo. I love learning new vocabulary. So authority is not one that I had run into before. Yeah, this is awesome. So authority, who's actually making the decision? If your device is calculating HP loss, then somebody could easily hack and tell the server how your HP changed. If instead you're passing up data to say something happened, now calculate what happened to my HP, the server can be the one doing it. That is much less hackable. I actually have my own question that I think will be interesting follow-up. So there's a lot of different there are infinite possible multiplayer games we could make. That's one of the magic things about game development. What are some of the games or perhaps genres that somebody could get started in? If somebody is just trying to get their feet wet with multiplayer, not going to be too hard. What are some of the types of games that they can make a true multiplayer game, not just LAN, not just on the same device, but it's not going to be a nightmare?
So I would say something that is low paced. So it could be a card game, for example, or let's say tic-tac-toe. Like you can play tic-tac-toe. It's easy. So yeah, the slowest the pace, the easier it gets. So if you, of course, the more you go towards making shooters, platformers, the more things get complicated. And in addition to that, the more players you are, the more things get complicated. So I would say something that is turn-based, for example, is a great choice. If you want to make, let's say, a clone of Pokemon, that would be a good thing as well.
Awesome. Yeah, anything that's turn-based means you can have discrete moments where the data is transferring, and you don't have to worry about prediction and reconciliation because you're just waiting for the player's turn. Worst case, you'll just wait a little bit longer. Love it. All right, last question of the day is from Namaste. Namaste says, what are your favorite multiplayer games?
Oh, okay. Well, I've been playing League of Legends for years. I stopped at some point, but that was one of my favorite ones. Right now, I would say PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds. Probably one of my favorite ones.
Returned. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I spent a lot of hours on that with friends, so it's a good one. So I would say this one. But I really play a lot of games over time. You know, when they ask you what's your favorite food, and you don't have an answer for that, like that. The same situation. Many of them. I would say fast-paced games and mobile games. You know, where you have some strategy and also some kind of skills that you need to use. And these are my favorite ones.
Awesome, love it. All right. Well, before we say goodbye today, one of the things that we always ask for Paolo is homework. So let's say somebody is trying to get started in multiplayer, or they're trying to understand the multiplayer world, or maybe they're trying to understand just multiplayer architecture. What is a piece of homework that you can give them that they can realistically finish in the next week? So not something too big, to understand this world a little bit better.
Well, I would say you can try making a very small game in which you have a character that moves, and then you need to click a button. And when you click this button with that character, it could be you step on a pressure plate, or you bump into an object. Another object spawns from the server on all clients. So you have a character, you go to a certain point, or you touch something, and that tells the server to spawn something in the world for every player that is playing. I would say that's like the very basic thing.
Nice. Okay. So make a game that is connected to a server. When you hit a button, the server tells the game to do something, to spawn something in the world. That is your homework for the next week. That's going to be a little bit more challenging for those who are engineering savvy. Create that for us and then break it down for us a little bit. Let us know how you actually did that so that other people can learn from it. Oh yeah, you've got more?
Yeah, I've just got like one piece of advice that I really like to be, to recommend to everybody. Please, please, please don't build your multiplayer framework. Like this is one of the this is one of the mistakes. Like lots of people say, "Oh, I can do my multiplayer framework." Yes, you can. It's going to take a lot of time. It's like building a game engine. You don't build a game engine. Okay, nowadays, like you used to do that 10 years ago, 20 years ago. You don't do it today unless you have very, very, very specific needs, which is a possibility. But in general, if you're getting started, don't build your multiplayer framework. Choose the one that fits your game, your use cases, and that will make your life much, much easier, especially because the popular frameworks have documentation, people that can help you, examples, these kinds of things. So
yeah,
that's my last bit of advice.
At this point in the game industry, that's kind of like building your own game engine. Like, yes, you can. No one's going to stop you, but it's not going to save you any time.
Yeah.
Love it. All right. So it is the end of the episode. Before anything else, if you do your homework, when you do your homework, I'd love to see that done. Tag us on Instagram. Excuse me. What the hell? Instagram. We don't use that. Tag us on LinkedIn at Indie Game Academy. We'd love to see your homework. We'd love to share it around a little bit for you. Or post it to our Discord here in the IGA Discord using the hashtag IGLH homework so we know you've done the homework. Before we say goodbye, is there any last messages you want to give the audience, Paolo, or anything you would like to plug here at the end?
Yeah, just typing in the chat. Like, if you want to connect with me, this is my LinkedIn. Feel free to add me. We can have a discussion. I also post a lot of content for free on multiplayer game development. So if you want to learn more over time, or if you're making your own game, that could be a good way to learn more about that. Simply
Awesome. Heck yeah. All right. If you're struggling with multiplayer, Paolo's your guy. We're going to link down below to his LinkedIn so you can check him out, reach out if you need it. And we'll also link to some of the other things you mentioned, like Fatus Games and a few of the other resources. Those will be in the description down below, including a link to come join us on Discord for the next episode. That's going to do it. It has been wonderful. Paolo, thank you for being here and helping us understand multiplayer better. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye.
Amazing. Bye-bye. And thank you for those who asked questions. And for those who are listening, as always, we ask that you send this along to just one other person who might enjoy it too. All right. Goodbye, everybody. Adios. Bye.